Welcome. Today's webinar on overcoming PCI DSS payment page requirement challenges ahead of, oops, it's not really a deadline, surprise, surprise. It's really the effective date, which everybody should know by now is April 1st of 2025. This webinar is being brought to you today by Jscrambler and Online Business Systems. My name is Jeff Mann, and I am joined today with us is Jeffrey Cleveland. That's how we're going to distinguish between the two of us. I'm Jeff. That's Jeffrey. And we welcome you to our webinar today. Just a couple housekeeping items. We're going to run this thing for about an hour, approximately 60 minutes, so up until the top of the hour. If you have questions, there is a chat box off to the side. There's also a question chat box. You can use either. We will be glancing at them throughout the webinar, but most likely we will save responses until the Q&A portion at the end. Additional resources will be available after the webinar. If we have any, we will share them with you. I've got one that I want to share. And also you will be receiving an email shortly after this event is completed with a link to the recording of the event, so you can share with friends and colleagues. Very briefly, I'm going to begin the discussion today with sort of an overview of the new PCI DSS requirements 643 and 1161, which is what we're here to talk about. Kind of give you the whys and the whats and the wheres and the whos, and then at some point I will turn over the microphone to Jeffrey, and he's going to kind of explain the how and give you some information on how to meet these requirements conveniently with some of the things that Jscrambler provides. And again, as I said earlier, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. We'll try to save some time to answer all your questions. So again, my name is Jeff Mann. I'm a senior information security consultant for a company called Online Business Systems, or OBS. I've been in the PCI business actually since the very beginning, since actually before the first PCI data security standard came out way back in 2004. So that's 20 years if you're counting with your fingers and toes that I've been doing PCI, primarily as what's called a qualified security assessor, or QSA. That role within the PCI ecosystem is someone that comes in as an independent third party to evaluate how well you are meeting all the various security requirements that are found in the PCI data security standard. I've actually been in this business of information security, or what we now call cybersecurity, over 40 years. So some of my viewpoints are perhaps a little bit antiquated. I remember the first websites when they were just simply HTML and there was no graphics or streaming anything, and they still took a half an hour to load over a 14.4K modem. But things have changed, and part of the reasons why we're talking today is because how things have changed and some of the new challenges that have been introduced by our modern technologies and architectures. So I want to spend a few moments just talking about why these requirements came about, why they are part of the PCI data security standard at this point, and frankly, why you should care about it if you are working for an organization, an entity, a merchant, or service provider that's engaging in one way, shape, or form in e-commerce. Quite simply, as time has evolved, and technologies have evolved, the bad guys, the people that are out there trying to monetize and make money by stealing things, in particular credit card information, the techniques for them going about doing that have changed and have evolved. In the early days of PCI, when the data security standard was first published, the conventional wisdom for what the bad guys wanted to do was to break into your fortress, your enterprise, find that repository, that database or mainframe where the tens of millions of transaction records were stored, all of which had full credit card information available, and pretty much nothing was encrypted back in those days. But the idea was bad guys are going to break in, find a way to break in, steal all at once, all your data, and get out and hopefully not get caught. And if you've been around long enough, you'll recall that there were some rather egregious breaches that happened in just that very manner back in the early to mid 2000s, the mid aughts. Fast forward a little bit, and as the enterprise started getting locked down, networks started getting locked down, primarily because people started following and taking seriously the data security standard, we got to the point where the bad guys were trying to find different ways to steal the credit card information. And sort of the next wave, the next evolution in terms of the methodologies of the bad guys was to do things like harvest the data. And that initially happened where they figured out ways to still breaking into the network very often, but embedding malware, which would basically harvest the transactions as they were being transmitted wherever they were being transmitted, and just over time harvest the tens of millions of credit cards and effectively still steal everything. It just took weeks and months for that to happen. And again, there was a spate of attacks sort of in the early to mid teens, to 2013, 14 range, where again, that kind of thing was happening, where major breaches of companies we've heard of. I'll not mention the names to protect the guilty, but that was exactly what was happening. The bad guys figured out ways to harvest or skim credit card information over time. Now in 2024, and in the last, this has been around probably 6 or 7 years now, the transition of this idea of skimming is not only happening in networks and sort of physical devices. The bad guys have figured out how to do this on e-commerce sites, on websites. And that is essentially why we are now talking about these two requirements. It just happened earlier this month. There was an announcement that a company called Select Blinds, I am assuming they sell blinds and window treatments, they discovered that they were victims of a malware attack that was exactly what we're talking about preventing and detecting against, where they essentially installed a skimming device where consumers of this company are typing in their information, where they're ordering their blinds and shades, and all the information that they type in is being harvested or skimmed and sent to the bad guys. The transaction still goes through. It still looks and feels like a legitimate transaction. It's just that the bad guys have captured all the information. This has actually happened recently in the last month or two with apparently Cisco, the IT security that wants to be a security company. They have an online merchandise store, and they discovered that they were also victims. And in fact, do a search on the type of attack that we're talking about is commonly referred to as a mage card attack. I can talk a little bit about in a moment why the name, but here's an article from an online news resource called Dark Reading, where they even mention Stripe payment skimmers. So a lot of e-commerce clients that I work with, they use Stripe on the back end as their third-party payment processor. That's where the iframe and the redirect goes to, and that's where all the credit card payment information is collected. Well, there's a skimmer that's even named after Stripe, because Stripe is so common out there and used so often with these systems. The mage card I mentioned, it came about because when these types of attacks were first discovered, it was targeting a platform called Magento. So it's sort of a play on the name Magento. And I did want to mention before we get into the actual requirements, I do a podcast on the side called Paul's Security Weekly. We recorded yesterday, so the episode 851 should be out by the time you're listening to this, either now or recording. If you listen to the news segment, and in particular, if you look at our show notes, one of my colleagues, Larry Pesce, found an article that actually is a great article that goes into a lot of detail on probably 8 or 10 different forms of malware of these types of mage card attacks. You can find this in our show notes. The website URL I'll share with you is securityweekly.com/podcast PSW, that stands for Paul's Security Weekly. So PSW-851. Scroll down until you see Larry's face with the news stories, and it's his story number 1, which is actually entitled 2024 Credit Card Theft Season Arrives, because it's now the holiday season. So the requirements, by now you should have read them. You probably are familiar with them, but just a very brief recap. 6.4.3 is talking about all the scripts, which is particularly or usually JavaScript is what we're talking about, that are loaded and executed in a consumer's browser are managed as follows. And they're looking for 3 things to happen. You want to make sure all the scripts that are present there are authorized. You want to make sure that they're valid, that their integrity has been validated in some way, shape, or form. And this is in an ongoing method. And then finally, just have some sort of justification, know why that script is there. The goal being that nothing is running there that you don't know about, that isn't supposed to be running. And this requirement to have this type of checks in place hopefully reduces the likelihood that bad scripts, malicious scripts, malware scripts have been somehow inserted into your website and ultimately into the client's browser. That's sort of what's required. Who are we talking about, or where does this requirement apply? That's where there's some room for interpretation and speculation to some degree. But the council is actually, as part of rolling out version 4.01 of the PCI Data Security Standard, has tried to clarify what they mean. They're referring to primarily, if you look at these bullet points, which are part of the applicability notes, which are sort of on the second page of the data security standard, the section that talks about this requirement. These are the applicability requirements. So they're trying to make sure you understand what they're talking about when they talk about the web page or the payment page, or some people might call it the checkout page. What they're mostly trying to emphasize here, in my QSA professional opinion, is they want to make sure that you're looking at the scripts that are involved in and are subsequently being loaded in your customer's browser. Any scripts that are there that are associated with when the little pop-up comes up and you're typing in your credit card information to close out. What they're struggling, I think, what a lot of us are struggling to get understanding of, is because in the old days, there was not this requirement. And for a lot of e-commerce merchants that try to simplify their PCI experience, they've done what is required to complete or qualify for the SAQA, which a lot of us call the short form in terms of PCI compliance, where it simply says, if you're not touching, if none of the payment data is ever traversing any of your equipment and applications and servers that are offering up your e-commerce experience, if it's all sent over to a third-party service provider like Stripe I mentioned earlier, all the traffic goes over to there, then all you really have to do is validate that you're using a PCI compliant third party, and you're done. This is where 643 is jumping out and saying, well, you're not quite done yet. The page, the area of your website where this is happening, where this iframe is a common method of presenting that checkout, where you're putting in the payment information, it's where that's coming from and things around it. I'll give you some examples very briefly as we advance. I mentioned SAQA. SAQA, when it was version 4, had this note that says, this is talking about the page where the iframe or iframes are being presented, which is actually the second bullet point in the applicability notes. SAQA version 4.0.1 added these applicability notes from the data security standard over to the SAQ to make it hopefully crystal clear what we're talking about in terms of what part of your web application, your e-commerce application, your payment page, or where the payment page is served or presented, or these iframes, that's where we're talking about. Again, the intent is we're trying to identify the scripts, the requirement 643, make sure that they're authorized, make sure that integrity is checked, and make sure you know about them in some sort of an inventory. Subsequently, then, very briefly, the 11.6.1 requirement is looking for any kind of change or tamper detection mechanism associated with the HTTP headers, which are often part of this presentation using all these different types of scripts. Now, very briefly, what does this look like? Here's the applicability notes. Again, what they're talking about in terms of where on the payment page, where on your website that this applies, the detection applies. And then finally, the guidance part of 11.6.1 shows examples of the different types of things that they're looking for to meet the requirement. More detail on that in a moment from Jeffrey. But very briefly, what this looks like is you've got your typical e-commerce page where you've started filling out your personal information, name and address of where you want the items shipped. You've got your shopping cart filled with items, and then at some point you're ready to pay. You click and there's a pop-up or a new page, and that's where you put in the credit card information. What we're talking about potentially is any and all of this is subject to these requirements, with a big depends, which is what Jeffrey will hopefully enlighten us on. But very basically, modern web architectures, all these scripts are loaded into what is commonly referred to as a sandbox. And within that sandbox, there's these JavaScripts, these scripts that are relatively powerful and relatively unregulated, which is why the bad guys are exploiting them, and which is why we now care about keeping track of them. But very briefly, and then I will flip it over to Jeffrey. Sort of in the old days when I started with PCI, e-commerce sites were single applications that would load from a server that would talk to a database on the back end, which is where all the information was stored. It was very much hardware based, very much physical devices. Nowadays, not so much. Of course, in the old days, it took forever to load these pages, but part of the reason why we have speed is because so much is happening and being sort of built dynamically in these sandboxes on the client side, what the customer is experiencing. And you can do it one of several ways, multiple page, where each sort of page, each section of your site is a separate page that gets loaded and there's separate sandbox. But more often than not, in modern architectures, these sandboxes are it's effectively one big sandbox, and all the different aspects and pages of your website are all just being built with these dynamic scripts, but the scripts are being effectively collected in a single sandbox, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So what you're left with when you're trying to deal with this essentially is figure out how your web application is built, talk to your developers, or if you outsource to a third party, it'd be great to be having discussions with them, talking about the actual architecture of your website, whether it's a single page application or a multi-page application, how many sandboxes are involved. The objective here is to identify all the scripts that are running that are required to fall under 643 and also required to fall under 11.6.1. But what a lot of people are going to want to do in the spirit of PCI and the spirit of cleaning things up, and people will look at it as reducing scope. I always like to think of it as reducing the footprint and reducing the signature of what's out there to be exploited. But if you want to reduce the scripts, basically what I'm getting at, there is the possibility of re-architecting your website to remove some of the scripts from that payment page, from that sandbox where the payment page is being built, so that you have fewer scripts to keep track of. From a security perspective, I would want to keep track of all of them, but pragmatically, it's just better to clean things up, and so you're managing and having to monitor and inspect and validate the fewest number of scripts as possible. Just because the more complex that is, more scripts that are out there, the more likely that things are missed. Bad guys get to find something that's been undetected and unobserved, and that's when the bad things happen and the theft occurs, and it's a bad day for everyone. So, my conclusion to my section is, hopefully giving you at least a glimpse of understanding of the what's and the where's and the why's. Going to turn this over to Jeffrey now, and hopefully he will explain to us at least some of how you can go about meeting these requirements, and perhaps how you can try to qualify what all the scripts are. Hopefully I'm setting you up for success here, Jeffrey, but I would like to turn it over to Jeffrey now for the rest of the webinar.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So yeah, just to kind of quickly introduce myself, my name is Jeffrey Cleveland. I've been a pre-sales engineer here at Jscrambler for the past 2 years and a few, and I'm currently a PCIP, so just starting to get into the PCI world from that front. But as far as JavaScript and what we're talking about today, that's what here at Jscrambler we've been dealing with for quite a while now, and that's kind of where I want to start. Jscrambler ourselves, we come from a position that's a little bit beyond just compliance, right? We certainly have compliance, and sometimes we have security that goes a little bit further than that, and we'll talk about both today. And so we've been in the JavaScript space for about 14 years now, and the product that we'll take a look at today, Web Page Integrity, that solves for these two requirements, has been in market before these particular requirements are out for PCI, where we've been protecting not only cardholder data, but also things like bank account details, IDs, passport numbers of airline passengers, and other sensitive types of data on the web in these types of applications for 5 going on 6 years now. So we've got a lot of experience in this space, and our solution is going to come with a lot of other security benefits, and we'll talk about a couple of different ways to deliver some of that information. But largely what I want to focus on is how are you going to approach these two requirements? How are you going to get compliant? And that's the first thing I'll talk about here. So a lot of the manual efforts, or we'll talk about efforts that don't involve a product, are going to have some kind of combination of CSP and SRI. CSP to restrict who's allowed to load in the page, to report if things load that they shouldn't, and to drive some alerting, and then SRI to control the exact version of a script in the page. Ourselves, we have 2 different approaches to applying web page integrity. You'll see I've got these listed here as the agentless monitoring, and then full client-side protection with an agent. And that agent's simply a piece of JavaScript that goes in the page that we'll talk about in detail a bit. Later here, you'll see there's some different capabilities, and we'll get into some of those details. But what I want to talk about first is, hey, what if we do decide to go for that CSP, that SRI approach? What's going to be asked of us as an organization? We're going to need, CSP is going to largely drive, ensuring that what's on the page is inventoried, is something that you've previously allowed to load, and can be more or less difficult to configure depending on what is on that page, right? Do you have a separate payment page, right? So not a single page application where you've got a very limited scope of JavaScript that's loading in there. Well, then your CSP might be quite simple if you have only a couple scripts, right? Maybe some from yourself, maybe some from a PSP. We found that that's not terribly common. Normally, you've got lots of other either marketing related scripts, user performance tracking, maybe some know your customer type scripts in those payment processes that are going to add to that inventory and make the CSP a bit longer, a bit harder to configure, but more importantly, SRI. SRI, of course, requires you to generate a hash for every script that's in the page, and then have that hash in the page before it loads, and anything that doesn't match those hashes will not load. Where we see the risk to the business, and that's kind of the second line I've got here, under the website performance challenges, SRI can very easily break the site. Say your payment processor changes a piece of script and you either aren't aware or haven't updated your hash yet, you may not have a checkout process. You might have everything but the payment fields, which of course is going to pose a risk to the business and not being able to collect revenue. Kind of a joke that I mentioned sometimes when we're at some of the community meetings or other kind of PCI spaces is between QSAs, between ISAs, people that work for merchants, vendors. We're all here certainly for PCI compliance, but we all have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, if we don't collect payments, we're all fired, right? Which is kind of a joke, but really isn't, right? At the end of the day, we want to make sure that the page is available for the client, for the cardholder to make a checkout, and SRI can introduce a lot of risk there. And so these numbers here are some that we have put together using some data from our clients, data from other large e-commerce environments that we see out on the internet, some mid-sized groups, and using that to extrapolate some of these costs to see, hey, if you do have outages, if you have to manage this stuff manually, here's what it could cost you. And really this operational challenge up here, this cost is driven by the complexity of the process that you'll need to support this, right? So not only are you going to need a tool, right, or a method, CSP, SRI, or a vendor, or some kind of solution, but you also need a process or policy to back up. How do you make decisions? Who makes the decisions when it comes to authorizing or examining script? And this is one that I've got here that's a little simplified, but for today, what I want to talk about is where a lot of that operational cost really gets introduced. You'll see in the bottom left corner is where we're starting. And this is, there's two tasks that need to be accomplished by here. I've suggested IT operations, which are either detecting that a new script has come into the page or that a script has changed, right? Once that process occurs, we need to make sure it's not malicious. I mentioned the idea of updating the hash and SRI. Well, if we just automatically update the hash every time we see a new file, are we actually checking to see if it's malicious? Are we, what's going to be the difference when we get that skimmer that comes along? How are we going to decide that that's a skimmer and therefore not update the hash, right? Prevent that loading. So there's some type of mechanism, some type of process that you need to implement there to decide, okay, is this script change malicious or is it not? Once we've made that decision, if we decide it is malicious, well, hopefully we just remove it from the page, right? Whether we do that by CSP or by a tool or removing it from a tag manager, any of that, right, would work for removing the script from the page. But if we determine it's malicious, let's get it out. If it's not malicious, then we might want to take a look and say, okay, does it exist on the page already? Well, if it doesn't, we need to contact the business side and say, hey, marketing, development, all these different groups. Hey, did you put this script here on the page, right? Is it doing what you mean for it to do? And that allows us to document why it's there. And then we can make the decision over an InfoSec, are we going to authorize the script? If not, we need to remove it from the page. If we are, we need to record all of that and then update that inventory in some way. And then the last route I've got is if that behavior, hasn't really changed, maybe all we do is update the inventory, right? We don't need to go back to the business to contact them and understand like, hey, why is this script here if it really has not changed? And in a lot of these areas, the real cost for a more manual approach of something like CSP or SRI or something that you develop in-house, a lot of the cost is going to come from operations. Certainly there's some costs associated with development, but keeping this system, this process alive and having many different groups of the business from IT operations and web dev, groups from InfoSec and compliance, and then groups from the business that might be marketing or payments group or otherwise. Lots of different communications that need to go around. And certainly in the worst case scenario, we get to a situation where the time from a script change being detected and determining that something is malicious, that time is quite long and then either results in a skim or some other risk to the business. But at the same time, we can't take too terribly long to decide if we're going to, update something because we need to process payments. It's not included in SRI, won't load in the page. Now we don't have a payment page. So that kind of presents the idea of why you might use a tool. And I'll come back to here and we'll talk about some methods that have been simplified. Of course, today I'm going to talk through our own solution for web page integrity that satisfies both these requirements, and we've got 2 ways of doing so. What I'll present before we jump over to the dashboard to take a look at the product is our hybrid deployment model. For web page integrity, we can collect compliance information in 2 ways. One is through agentless monitoring, which you'll see I've got labeled up there at the top. You'll see this written as synthetic user session monitoring in the guidance column of the DSS, where we go through, we load a payment page using a browser that's controlled by our group, and go through a payment transaction and observe everything that happens in that particular transaction, that process, in order to collect information for compliance. This is great because it's very quick to deploy. It's very easy to deploy. All we need is a URL and access to the payment page, which might be some test accounts or things in that nature. This happens periodically, and of course can detect if there is a web skimmer or other type of credential leaking or stealing attack going on in that session. So very quick to deploy, very easy to deploy. Moving to the agent-based model that you'll see pictured on the bottom, in this case, we actually provide a single line of script that you include, much the same as other scripts in the page that we're seeking to manage. And we can see what those scripts are doing. We can monitor their behavior. We'll take a look at that in real user sessions. So as your clients, cardholders, are making a checkout, it's continuous. We take a look at every session. And then if we do detect an issue, we can immediately take action against that skim, or even if it's just a misconfiguration, we can take action to limit the impact of that skim, of that misconfiguration, before we have time to go in and do a full investigation and say, hey, are we going to remove this script or contact a third party, something to that nature. In either model, we're only reporting information back to our services, so we're not making your checkout session reliant on the agent and its behavior. Again, wanting to preserve that availability of the payment session. We'll see some more of that here in the in the live demo. And then once that information's back in the web page integrity services is where we'll decide to either generate a notification for the admin team, send that information, or just make it available to the dashboard, or update that to prevent further skims or further credential leaks. Other notes to make here, though, neither of these approaches require you to have your own infrastructure or to deploy any type of tooling locally. All of this is taken care of by ourselves here at Jscrambler. And we also, either implementation by itself will help you achieve compliance. You don't need to use one, the other, or both. You can use one or the other. You don't need to use both. And in a lot of our licensing models, you can in fact use agentless on some, use agent in other areas, or even move back and forth as risk or different challenges change around. But here's where I want to actually jump over to the demo environment. We'll go over to this dashboard here that you see pictured, and take a look at what this management process looks like over there. If you give me one moment.
I don't want to distract you while you're bringing up the demo, but I do have a couple questions that hopefully you can show in the demo. One of which is, you guys are obviously in the business of monitoring websites. Out of curiosity, what's the magnitude of the problem in terms of just volume of scripts that are out there? Do you have a sense of what's an average e-commerce site, how many scripts are involved?
Yeah, and a lot of it depends too on the nature of the business, right? Some of it is, certainly in more like retail e-commerce sides is where we're going to see the what we'll call vendor services start seeing in the 30s and 40s, maybe even up to 80 or 100. But I think an important thing to understand is that when you're adding one script, you might not necessarily get one script. You might get far more than that, right? A script may load a dependency, it may load other libraries that it needs. And so commonly what we'll see is that where someone's like, oh yeah, we have Google Tag Manager, for example. Really, even just Google Tag Manager is bringing in other things to support itself. And it's part of the reason why we use the vendor services grouping I'll explain here in a second to bring that number down to make it a little bit more manageable. So certainly can go anywhere from, I would say on average on the low side is like 20-ish scripts, but we've seen up to 150, 200. And then you'll have some weird situations where people might be, well, not weird, it's getting more and more common, but say they're dynamically generating script.
Sure.
Do you consider every version to be the same scripts? Well, SRI does not. So you could have a situation where you have thousands associated with a single vendor. And then you kind of get into a situation of, okay, do I need to authorize each of those dynamic scripts? Or am I just going to say, okay, well, it's just for this vendor? And that's where I'm going to start. So it's kind of a perfect.
Well, and I think that's a segue into what my second question was going to be, because in the new requirement, there's, as far as the applicability goes, there's a reference to this applies to not only you, the merchant's scripts, but any third party, and they even say fourth party. So my question was going to be, do you, and it looks like you're about to demo it. This is great, but how do you distinguish who owns the scripts, or what's the origin of the script?
Yeah.
And so please proceed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start here within our vendor services view. What we've done, I mentioned that web page integrity kind of started from a kind of a more broad scope where we were really looking at protecting any type of sensitive data in the page, and surely we do that today still. But what we've done for PCI is developed a PCI DSS module that is both a technical and commercial offering where you can get just what you need for these requirements, just for the payment pages. And that's what I'm going to go through today. So anything that I mentioned is part of that technical commercial offering. Of course, if you have other concerns about, hey, we take passport numbers, we take, IDs or other sensitive pieces of information, logins, account numbers, we can certainly look at protecting that. But today, since we're all here for PCI DSS, will stick to that scope. So the first part is this vendor services view. And this view is largely mapped to requirement 643, though there is some overlap. And where we start with that is the inventory. So what we do to make the inventory a little simpler to manage, as I alluded to, is we group scripts into what we call vendor services. And as the name implies, it's typically made up of a vendor and then the service that they're providing to you in the page. I've got Google Tag Manager here as an example. Any script that's associated with this vendor service will show inside of its inventory. We'll take a look for Tag Manager here. Will be listed under the scripts view. Here I've just got one, but if it were made up of multiples, you'd see those here. And in the case of tag managers, especially if they're loading other scripts, right, from other vendor services, your marketing teams or what have you are using these to load other vendor services, they will get their own entry. As you'll see out here is, there's some others for Stripe, New Relic, PayPal, all receiving their own entry within this vendor services view. The next part of 643 is that authorizing. And I've got two examples here today of a vendor service that we're going to authorize, one being Stripe and one full story. So how convenient, you mentioned Stripe earlier, Jeff, where we'll go through and do the authorization and understand why we might authorize or might decide to restrict a particular vendor service, how we'll help with that process. So to get into Stripe, taking a look at them, you'll see they're showing in this needs review status, which is how we'll highlight any vendor service that should be reviewed for the purposes of compliance. You'll see I've got everybody else sitting in this authorized green button status. So let's go through Stripe. When I click on the view details button, I will be given a history among a couple other panes, and we'll see that Stripe is here because they've just been detected on the page. So they have no previous authorization. So web page integrity saying, hey, do you want to give them an authorization? Well, we can decide if we want to authorize Stripe by examining their behavior. You'll remember I mentioned, hey, when we see a vendor service, when we see a piece of script, we want to understand something about it before we make that decision. Here in the behaviors view, we can see exactly what Stripe wants to do in the page. Well, in this case, they want to transfer data back to stripe.com. They want to add an iframe to the page in some instances. And then this page also sometimes collects the payment data in a form that's directly in the page. So we also have where they're collecting data from that form. Now, Stripe is a card processor. So of course they need access to the card data and they need to transmit it in order to process it. And since they're doing all of that with their own domain, looks pretty safe. And we'll go ahead and decide to authorize them.
Well, and if I can interject,
Sure.
it's important, I think, to point out that the 643 requirement does spend a fair amount of time saying, in this example, you, the merchant, are not responsible for any scripts that are running on what Stripe, once the iframe presents
Right.
whatever Stripe is
In the
presenting.
frame.
They've got their own scripts and they're
Mhm.
PCI compliant. So they've got their own QSA reviewing what they're doing to keep track of all. And hopefully they're a customer of yours too. But that's on them. It's all the scripts that you're discovering that are before you get to the Stripe
Before the
part
frame, right.
is
Yeah.
what the merchant it needs to worry about and is concerned about. And that's why they need you. I'll let you go continue.
Yeah. And that's what we're seeing. Like I said, that's what we're detecting here is what's outside of the frame, right? So an
Mm-hmm.
important note to make, and the original reason that everybody moved to frames for processing cards is that script outside of the frame can't reach inside and vice versa. There's some caveats there, but for today, I think that's enough. Scripts inside the frame also can't reach outside of the frame directly, and so that creates, one of those sandboxes that Jeff was talking about, restricts the scope of those scripts and doesn't allow them to access data directly. So what we're seeing here is the script that Stripe is putting into, in this case, the merchant's payment page to generate that iframe. And so when we go through and authorize them, we want to make sure that they can do networking, right? This observed networking that they have shown. We want to make sure that they can add the iframe to the page. And then in situations where we don't, we also want to make sure they can grab that data from the form. Now, what this is going to do when I hit save is it's going to create on the back end what we call a behavior contract. And what this says is, okay, I understand that Stripe, this vendor service, and by extension, the collection of scripts, are going to exhibit certain behaviors in a page in a normal circumstance. As long as those scripts stick to those normal behaviors, we'll still examine the scripts to make sure that they're safe, check and make sure they don't contain any known bad script or otherwise, but we won't ask you to reauthorize the Stripe vendor service. We've already accepted a level of risk from Stripe and said, hey, it's okay if they add frames to the page, this particular frame, it's okay if they communicate with this domain, and as long as any scripts that come after that or are modified, changed, followed by that behavior contract, we won't ask for that reauthorization. So even though we're doing some checks in the background to make sure that those scripts are safe, I'm not going to ask you to come back in and look at the exact same information to approve that script. The opposite of that is what we'll see here with full story. And if we look at their details, we'll see that not too long ago, a coworker of mine, a John F., came through here and provided some initial authorizations for a full story, but now we've got some changes to, in fact, the same three behaviors that Stripe was asking for. So let's take a look at those. When we take a look, we'll have some blue dots here that are showing us, highlighting to us the new behaviors or modifications to a behavior in this case. And if you'll pardon my blatant naming scheme here, I've got a domain that we perhaps don't trust so much, a new full story domain, and then in this case, another domain that they don't necessarily own. We've also got them now wanting to add an iframe to the page, which is a little suspicious. And then also have them accessing the form data where previously they were only grabbing an email. Now they're grabbing all the card information as well. So little suspicious. So what can we do? When the agent-based model of web page integrity, when we go to authorize, we can in fact authorize full story to be back in the page, but we're going to be able to restrict it. We can say, hey, we want to block some features of the script, and in this case, let's choose to block all. We'll block all the networking, the form data access, and the iframe actions to prevent them from potentially leaking any payment information off the page. And when we do that, we will, of course, move full story back to authorized. First, we'll go to this ready to apply status that will ask us to rebuild the agent. We will include all of the rules, all the behaviors that the agent should perform when it encounters full story into that agent code, and then redeploy it out to our CDN. And the very next person that goes through a checkout will get this updated version of the agent. And just to show, how that looks for the end client, I'll go through a quick checkout session here. We'll kind of skip through the shopping section and the address, go straight to the payment form. So what we'll see while we're here is even though the agent is in the page, and even though it's preventing certain behaviors by full story, it doesn't cause the page to slow down, have poor performance, or otherwise break the experience or the transaction for the end client. So it's still easy for them to go through, make a normal transaction just like they would expect, get a confirmation page, and move on, right? So for them, the process is completely transparent, even though we're taking extra actions in the page that will get detailed about back over here on the dashboard in the live feed. And in the live feed, we'll see a number of different alerts that are coming in that are confirming for us that we've blocked some behavior. Some of that being where Full Story is trying to add a frame to the page. And for many of you out there that are in, say, like SAQA type merchants or others that are framing in their payments, this is what we would expect to see if there's a web skim attack against your page in particular. We'll be able to collect the information about anything from the headers of that frame, if they're defined, and also be able to tell you exactly which script and then what document in this case is causing this behavior. And even if it's a script triggered by a script on down, we'll give you that stack trace to make it easy to go back and find out who's generating this iframe. And this is really important, and like Jeff, you mentioned earlier, a lot of these skims are starting to target frames. Another one that would be good reading if you take a look, and hopefully is in that article you referenced, one that we've seen recently is what we call silent skimming, where the attacker, rather than trying to copy the frame manually, instead they will examine the payment processor when they make a request to load the frame. That Stripe script we looked at earlier, they will do the same request. The attacker will, and then use a copy of that frame, put it back on their server, serve it from their own domain, and it will look exactly like the payment processor script or iframe, because it is, right? It's a perfect copy of it. They'll show it in front of the malicious script, or sorry, the malicious frame will be in front of the legitimate frame. They'll ask the cardholder, in this case the victim, to enter information in that frame, and once the transaction has gone through the malicious one, they will say, oh, hey, sorry, there was an error, would you please try again, and then move the legitimate frame to the front. That way it's very hard for both the cardholder and for the merchant to detect that there is some type of skimming going on, because legitimate transactions still occur, and to the cardholder it just looks like a small error. But here we can pick out those exact behaviors and help you to either mitigate them, which we've done here with the agent, or to come up with a way to remove that from the page and keep the cardholder and the business safe.
Well, it's funny because in the early days of the internet, this whole notion and idea was something that was done with various different communications protocols back then, but things that we used to call session hijacking or man in the middle of attacks, these are really just sort of evolutions of those concepts. So sort of old ideas, just new application.
Right.
Good job.
Right.
Good job, bad guys.
Yeah. Well, and that was
why we need tools like yours to try to detect.
Yeah, I was explaining the attack to someone, and I was like, it would be really cool if it wasn't like, stealing people's credit card debts. A really, actually very shockingly simple attack to execute. I believe our CTO actually gave a talk at the last community meeting, and he was like, yeah, I have a little live demo to show this attack, and I think the attack is made up of like 100 lines of code, right? It's not complex, and the the code execution, right, the idea behind it is, but how simple the actual attack is
right,
would be impressive if it wasn't an attack, right?
Yeah, but that's why we now have these requirements that we have to meet, because because of the shifting attention of the bad guys. What we need to start doing more and more.
Sure.
My concern is that more merchant clients and entities that are subject to these requirements will spend more time trying to simplify and reduce scope rather than doing what I would consider the right thing to minimize the likelihood of an attack. I think what helps the latter to happen is tools like what you guys are offering, which kind of it seemingly makes it easy to do the right thing.
Yeah, and that's where we kind of have, through the vendor services view, have combined both the compliance task, right? Hey, the justification and the authorizing, all that gets combined from not just the
Right.
compliance, but into that, security that you're getting in the page by taking these authorizations and converting them to rule sets and saying, well, hey, you're not allowed to do this in the page. I,
Mhm.
the agent, know that based on the authorizations of the merchant. And we're doing that in a way that doesn't require every merchant to be a professional in JavaScript, right?
Right.
That's one of the things, if you look at the DSS, as far as requirements that regard JavaScript, there's really only a couple, right? There's a few, and even for web applications, I think there's really only 4 or 5 in the entire DSS. And so certainly, even if you're a very well-versed PCI professional, you may not have a ton of knowledge in web applications. And so that's why we want to kind of bring that experience back to make it simple, right? As far as, okay, what effect does this have on the cardholder data? And use that to make decisions rather than, okay, I see a change in JavaScript, which may not mean anything.
In your professional opinion, when there's so many e-commerce sites that are sort of being managed and maintained and hosted by third parties, um, do you have advice or guidance for the merchants? Because the merchants are the ones that are
Sure.
quote unquote on the hook for the compliance, to make sure that all the third and fourth party players are in alignment. And because I can easily imagine a merchant thinking, well, I'm not doing the website, that's my third party, surely they're
Right.
doing it. What are the right questions to ask to make
Yeah.
sure it's all happening?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the requirements a lot of the advice on our side is really, hey, if you have script that you can take out, you
Hmm.
should, right?
Right.
And that comes from understanding the inventory. Now, practically, that's not a real choice. The business has lots of different scripts that, let's jump back over to vendor services view. I've got just a few here.
Hmm.
Things like tag managers, things like pixels that can be used for, ad retargeting. And likely you have a pixel from, a lot of the big, certainly social media groups, and then advertisers. You've got all these different scripts that serve a business purpose, right? And that's why the requirement's written that way. So it's not really practical to just remove these. Now you can have a solution like ours that sits out of band from your web dev teams, right? This doesn't have to be deployed by a web
Hmm.
dev team. So you can have a wholly outsourced development team and use the agentless model, right? And we can monitor the page, we can show you what's there, and help you understand that. And then, through the compliance requirements, hopefully you're going back to the business and understanding, hey, we have 40 vendor services on the page. Why? What are these here
Hmm.
for? Are they things we've forgotten about? Do we need to, do some other investigations to make sure we understand, what we're using these for and where this data is going? And then also taking a look at, even if you have something legitimate, what we'll see are tools like user experience tracking, like Full Story, which in this case we're more simulating a malicious attack,
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
we'll see just either a misconfiguration or a lack of configuration cause extra information to be written over to kind of a third-party area that's not in scope for PCI. So an example,
Okay.
we had Hotjar picking up the
Hmm.
full card information from every session, right? And then making that
Right.
available for replay. Well, likely if you went back and looked at their scoping document, they likely don't include Hotjar, in their data
Hmm.
storage in their scope. You're
Right.
also now copying information that you're never supposed to record, right? You're never supposed to record the CVV,
Hmm.
but now you have that along with the other fields all in one database. And so that's actually what we see more commonly than the malicious side. Now, obviously, you're still open to those
Right.
malicious attacks, but it's really that kind of like accidental scope creep of your PCI compliance.
Okay. Just want to interject real quick to our audience. Now's the time to ask questions if you
Yes.
have them. We've got a few minutes left for answering any questions. I know I've been bogarting the mic by asking my questions, but any closing thoughts, jumping back to the slide deck, Jeffrey, while we're waiting for any
Yeah,
questions to come
just the
in?
last piece of what I want to show here. A lot of the HTTP header management, the way we manage that is through baselining. So if you have a header, it's a header that you expect to see. You simply
Mhm.
review it, and by authorizing it, you're adding it to a baseline where we can say, hey, this is one that you expect to see, and we won't generate an alert on. Once we've been through the vendor services view and the headers view, these alerts here are the last component of 11.6.1, where we'll actually
Okay.
drive all these compliance related alerts into here, and then we out of here via webhook and some other integration options.
Mhm.
Here we can, we only get 4 types of alerts, right? So the new vendor service, a vendor
Mhm.
service that's had a significant change, an increase in risk, a new HTTP header has been detected, or a new value for a header. And of course, those are security related headers. All that's to say, through here, kind of returning to our process, you can see where there's
Mhm.
some areas that web page integrity simplifies this process, right? Script
Right.
detected or a script change, that's now automated by web page integrity. Checking for a script being malicious, well, now we have the behavior available to make that decision. If a script's not malicious and the change doesn't affect its behavior, well, we're going to jump straight to updating the inventory for you. All that's automatic. If you do find something malicious and you need to start that process of removing the script from the page, some of that we can take care of and start to, remove the concerning elements to really limit the effect of that particular script. So that's
Great.
kind of the takeaways and how we're going to change up operations, make that operation simpler and certainly
Mhm.
more cost effective. So since we're not having to involve so many components from the business now.
Great. So we did get a question in
Mhm.
from the audience. I'd like to share with you. They reference the responsibility matrix, or the shared responsibility matrix, which is the part of PCI that attempts to point the fingers as to who's responsible for what. And in some cases, it's the
Mhm.
third party. In some cases, it's the merchant, as the name implies. In some cases, there's a little of both. But the question is, does your product read all the scripts, and can you discard the scripts that a third-party service provider would treat as their responsibility?
The answer is that we do read them all.
Mm-hmm.
The disregarding of a script that comes from a TPSP, um, if they were providing you some type of insurance that they were protecting the integrity of that script, potentially. That would, of course, come down to what your QSA would say,
Mm-hmm.
and into the quality of that integrity checking. What we're doing is checking for the integrity of that PSP script, assuming that they won't do that for you. They may, right? You could certainly check with your third party and
Mm-hmm.
see if that particular TPSP is going to provide integrity. In our case, we do. Okay, so we'll be
Right.
one of the few TPSPs that in our responsibility matrix, we do state, hey, we provide integrity for the script. We provide it through another tool that's we've been developing for the past over a decade now. That's called Code Integrity. That's been
Mm-hmm.
used for exactly this purpose, ensuring integrity of JavaScript. Um, and so we will have in our responsibility matrix where, yes, we are providing some integrity to that script that's being issued. But a lot of your
Okay.
payment processors you'll find will either have very little or won't have that at all, and are kind of expecting the merchant environment to be clean so that once they put that script in there, it's not going to
Mm-hmm.
be affected or tampered, which may or may not be true depending on the exact situation.
Yeah, and I would add, from the QSA perspective, the way I read the requirement, uh, very explicitly, the council says if the TPSP in question is the one that's providing the payment page, the one that is PCI compliant, that's seeing all the payment data, those are the scripts you don't have to worry about and can disregard or discard. But it's any other fourth party script that might be in that sandbox. You still are on the hook for them, even though you might be able to go to them and say, hey, are you doing PCI compliance? Are you looking at your own scripts that are ending up on our website? So I think it's a little bit of a discussion where what I like is that your tool identifies who they're coming from, which will help make that facilitate that discussion a lot easier.
Yeah. Couple things here while we're waiting to see if there's other questions. What we saw here is kind of this first item, right? Behavior-based authorization workflow. We can take that a little bit further. Since we are an assessed organization, we have the knowledge and expertise. You can also shift a lot of these tasks over to our teams through a program that we call delegated compliance, where we'll actually make the approvals and authorizations largely for you, and then only come back to you if there is a serious problem, a web skimming attack, a leak of cardholder data that needs some extra attention. And then we also provide the ability to follow either the compensating control or customized approach, which is perhaps an even deeper discussion for another time. But it is possible through the tool where you actually don't have to keep up the inventory anymore, and you can restrict what's happening on the page to a level that if a skimming attack were to happen, it would be prevented from executing, and that then meets the compensating control or customized approach.
Right. We're at the top of the hour, but there's a couple people typing. I'm just waiting for the questions to come through.
See if we get a couple more.
Otherwise, here's one that popped out. How about SPAs where all the JavaScript is grabbed from NPM and bundled together?
I might even say that one might be a better QSA question. Our viewpoint, the way we handle it, is to be on the safe side, where we actually take a look at the entire SPA, assuming that the payment fields appear in SPA itself. We'll take a look at the entire application to be safe, right? If a script is loaded when the payment fields appear, it could have an effect on those fields or on the iframe. And that's what we're trying to prevent, is we're trying to prevent those other scripts from having an effect on either the payment fields or the frame. But there's also other situations that are perhaps a bit more niche where they could go through and even do something like overriding the browser's default API or some monkey patching or injecting extra script into the page. Even if those scripts have been unloaded or aren't being used anymore, they could have already done the damage by the time we see the payment fields. So from a security aspect, that's why we look at the entire application. Jeff, on a compliance standpoint, I'll let you take that.
Well, I've always felt that PCI is a security standard. I try to redirect compliance discussions to security discussions, and pretty much would echo what you're saying in terms of, evaluate each script on its likelihood of impacting the iframes that we care about, and could it be used. So, to use the favorite phrase of QSAs throughout the land, it depends. Final question, and then we should probably wrap up. Follow up. Could this be mitigated by a separate minimalist payment window? And I'll jump in and say absolutely. If you're willing to go through re-architecting your website and you want to minimize the scripts that are on the payment page or associated with that iframe that's launching the payment page, I think that is the ideal in terms of minimizing the footprint, as it were. Any thoughts to add, Jeffrey?
Yeah, as long as you're fully redirecting, right? Of course, if you build a separate minimalist payment window and then you iframe it into the SPA anyway, you're practically doing the same thing the payment processor is doing. If that's your initial setup. So yes, as long as you're fully redirecting out, there are still attacks that can go after that redirect, but we can keep looking back and back and back, right? As soon as the application loads, right, you could do something to redirect the client out. So I think as far as compliance goes, yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of reducing that.
And a good rule of thumb too is, if you make it more complicated for the attacker, they're more likely just going to go on and find somebody else that's an easier target because they haven't made the fixes or done the re-architecture. So there's definitely a principle of Like the analogy I used to use is if you live on a city block or a suburban neighborhood with a lot of houses, and everybody's got a sign out front, this home protected by fill in the blank at your security company. The bad guy's likely just going to go find the house that doesn't have the sign up in front of it, and that's where they're going to target. But
yeah, used to say it was like running from a bear, right? You didn't have to be first, but you really didn't want to be last.
Right. Well, and these days there's more than one bear, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right. There's one more question being typed. It's just saying thank you. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I appreciate those that tuned in today, and please, when you get the recording, share with your friends and colleagues. Feel free to reach out to either company in terms of follow-up questions. Again, thanks everybody for their time today. Thanks, Jeffrey. And this is Jeff Mann, and we look forward to the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.